The Japanese soldier is dying when Corpsman Robert Hayes drops beside him on Peleliu's Coral Ridge. He's maybe 22, gut shot, and his eyes go wide with terror when he sees the American medic reaching for him. He tries to pull a grenade with his left hand. His right arm is shattered, but Hayes is faster. He kicks it away, tears open the soldier's uniform, and starts packing the wound while the kid screams something that sounds like a prayer. 20 yards away, Hayes's own squad is still taking fire from the cave this soldier was defending 10 minutes ago. Hayes doesn't look up. He just keeps working, his hands slick with another man's blood, and says what he always says, "I got you, buddy. I got you." Robert Hayes was a pharmacist's son from Duluth, Minnesota, and he'd been a Navy corpsman attached to the 1st Marine Division for 14 months when he hit the beach at Peleliu on September 15, 1944. He was 24 years old, weighed 140 pounds soaking wet, and carried 40 pounds of medical supplies in a pack that had "Medic" stenciled on it in letters big enough to read from 50 yards. That target on his back was supposed to protect him under the Geneva Convention. The Japanese hadn't signed the Geneva Convention. They told us in training the Japs would shoot medics first. Hayes wrote to his sister 3 weeks before the invasion. "Aim for the guy trying to save lives." I don't know if I believe that, but I guess I'll find out. He kept a photograph of his kid brother Tommy in his helmet band. Tommy was 17 and wanted to be a medic too. The other men in the battalion called Hayes Doc. They all did. Every corpsman got that name. But his particular squad called him Deacon because he didn't curse and he'd tried to hold a prayer service on the troop ship before Peleliu. 3 men showed up. Sergeant Mike Kowalski from Chicago was one of them. Hayes was too good for this war, Kowalski said years later. Too gentle. But when the shit hit, he was the toughest son of a bitch I ever saw. The Marines lived in a strange intimacy with their corpsmen. Every rifle squad had one, and he was part of them but separate. He carried no weapon, which meant someone else had to protect him while he worked. That created a peculiar bond. You'd take a bullet for your corpsman because you knew goddamn well he'd take one for you, Kowalski said. And Hayes would take one for anybody, even the enemy. We thought he was crazy. The 1st Marine Division had been preparing for Peleliu for 3 months, training on Pavuvu in the Russell Islands where it rained every day and the mud never dried. They studied maps of the coral ridges, practiced cave warfare, learned that this was supposed to be a 3-day operation to secure an airfield. Intelligence said the Japanese had maybe 10,000 troops on the island. Intelligence was wrong about almost everything. What the intelligence reports got right was the nature of the Japanese defense. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded the garrison, and he'd abandoned the old tactic of suicidal banzai charges. Instead, he'd fortified Peleliu's ridges with 500 interconnected caves, some of them 5 levels deep, with interlocking fields of fire and stockpiled supplies for months. His orders from headquarters were clear. Kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier lost. Make them pay for every foot of coral. Nakagawa's orders said nothing about taking prisoners, nothing about mercy for wounded enemies. In the Japanese military code, Bushido as the soldiers understood it, surrender was worse than death. Dishonor to yourself, your family, your emperor. The Americans didn't understand this. They thought the Japanese fanaticism was madness. The Japanese thought American willingness to surrender and take prisoners was weakness, proof that Americans had no honor, no warrior spirit. But there was something else in Nakagawa's defensive plans that the Americans didn't know until they encountered it. His troops had been told that the American medics were a trick, that the Red Crosses were a deception, that Americans would pretend to offer medical help only to torture prisoners. This wasn't entirely propaganda. Both sides had heard stories, true and false, and rumors in war multiply like bacteria. But it meant that wounded Japanese soldiers feared American medics almost as much as they feared capture itself. At dawn on September 15th, Hayes checked his gear for the 10th time. Morphine syrettes, battle dressings, sulfa powder, tourniquets, plasma bottles, scissors, tape. He'd put on fresh socks. An old medic had told him that was important. You'd be on your feet for days, and he'd written one more letter home that he wouldn't mail until after the battle, if he survived to mail it. "By the time you read this," it began, "you'll know whether I made it or not." The landing craft hit the reef at 0832. Hayes went over the side into chest-deep water that was warm as blood, and he was 50 yards from shore when he heard the first man scream for a corpsman. The beach at Peleliu is white coral that crunches under your boots like broken bones, and it's already 110 degrees by 0900. Hayes makes it to shore, finds cover behind a disabled Amtrak, and starts working on his first casualty, a kid from Tennessee with shrapnel in his thigh, not life-threatening but bleeding badly. The kid keeps apologizing for getting hit. Hayes tells him to shut up and hold still. The Marines push inland toward the airfield, and Hayes moves with his squad through terrain that's like nothing he's trained for. This isn't jungle. It's coral ridges torn up like the moon, with jagged edges that cut through clothing and skin. Every ridge has caves. Every cave has Japanese soldiers who've been waiting for this moment for months. The heat is so intense that men start dropping from heat exhaustion before they take enemy fire. By noon, Hayes has treated 14 wounded Marines and used half his morphine. He's calling for a resupply when he hears the screaming from ahead. Not English, not a Marine. Japanese. Someone's wounded in the coral outcropping 30 yards forward where 2nd Squad tried to flank a machine gun nest. Kowalski grabs Hayes's arm. "Don't. That's a trap, Doc. They're faking it." But Hayes is already listening to the quality of the scream, the way a medic learns to distinguish real agony from anything else. "That's real," he says. He looks at the outcropping. There's maybe 15 yards of open ground, and the machine gun is still firing, but from a different angle now. If he stays low, hugs the coral, he might make it. "Fuck that," Kowalski says. "Let him die." Hayes is already moving. He crawls on his belly, medical bag dragging behind him, and the coral tears his uniform and the skin underneath. He can hear the machine gun traversing, searching. The screaming has gotten weaker. He makes it to the outcropping and peers around. There's a Japanese soldier wedged in a coral crevice, both legs shattered, trying to reach a grenade on his belt with a hand that's not working right. He's maybe 19, smooth-faced, and when he sees Hayes, he starts screaming something different. Not pain now, but terror. "Easy," Hayes says, knowing the kid can't understand the words, but maybe he'll understand the tone. "Easy. I'm a medic." He shows his hands. Empty. No weapon. The kid is still trying for the grenade. Hayes moves fast, pins the kid's working arm, yanks the grenade away and tosses it over the ridge. Then he starts cutting away the torn uniform from the shattered legs. The kid is crying now, saying something over and over. It sounds like Okasan, which Hayes will learn later means mother. His legs are destroyed, both femurs broken, and he's already lost too much blood. Hayes gets a tourniquet on the right leg, starts packing the left one with dressings that turn red instantly. He's reaching for morphine when the kid tries to bite him. Not attacking, but trying to kill himself by biting his own tongue. Hayes has seen this before with head wounds, men trying to escape pain the only way left. But this is different. This kid is choosing death over being saved by an enemy. "No, you don't," Hayes says, and he gets his fingers in the kid's mouth, pries it open, holds the jaw. "Kowalski, I need help here." Kowalski comes over the ridge with 2 other Marines, and they're pointing rifles at the wounded Japanese soldier like he might still be dangerous. Maybe he is. There are stories of wounded Japanese playing dead and then detonating grenades when American medics get close, but this kid is dying fast, and Hayes needs hands. "Hold his arms," Hayes says. "Don't hurt him, just hold him still." "You're out of your fucking mind, Doc," Kowalski says, but he kneels down, pins the kid's arms. Another Marine, Miller from Oklahoma, holds the legs as still as possible while Hayes works. The kid is going into shock, his skin cold and clammy despite the heat, his breathing shallow. Hayes gets plasma going, shoots morphine into the kid's thigh, keeps packing wounds. "He's gonna die anyway," Miller says. "Why you doing this?" "Because he's wounded," Hayes says, like it's the most obvious thing in the world. "Same reason I'd do it for you." They work on him for 20 minutes. 20 minutes while Marines are still dying from that machine gun nest, while the battle is still raging 50 yards away. Hayes gets the bleeding mostly stopped, gets the kid stabilized enough to maybe survive if they can get him to the battalion aid station. He's calling for a stretcher team when the Japanese counterattack comes. It's not a banzai charge. Nakagawa has forbidden those as wasteful, but it's close. 30 Japanese soldiers come out of a cave complex no one knew was there, firing everything they have. The Marines fall back to a better position, dragging their wounded, and Hayes stays with the Japanese kid until the last possible second. Then Kowalski picks Hayes up bodily and carries him to cover, while Miller and another Marine grab the stretcher with the enemy soldier on it. "You're gonna get us all killed over a fucking Jap," Kowalski says, and he's furious, but he's still helping carry the stretcher. They make it to the battalion aid station, where Navy Surgeon Lieutenant Edward Farrell is working on a makeshift operating table that's just a stretcher on ammunition boxes. He's been operating for 6 hours straight. He looks at the Japanese kid, looks at Hayes. "You brought me a prisoner?" "I brought you a patient," Hayes says. Farrell is quiet for a moment. Then he nods. "Put him over there. I'll get to him after I finish with Corporal Davidson." Davidson is a Marine with a sucking chest wound, already unconscious. The Japanese kid is conscious, staring at the ceiling of the aid station tent, tears running down his face. Hayes sits next to him, checks his vitals, adjusts the plasma drip. The kid looks at him, says something in Japanese. Hayes doesn't understand the words, but he understands the question in the kid's eyes. "Why?" "It's what we do," Hayes says quietly. "It's all we can do." 3 hours later, Lieutenant Farrell operates on the Japanese soldier, saves his right leg, amputates the left one. The kid survives. He's one of the first Japanese prisoners taken on Peleliu who lives long enough to reach the hospital ship. But that's just the first one. Hayes will do this 16 more times before Peleliu is over. The battle for Peleliu was supposed to last 3 days. It lasted 73. The 1st Marine Division suffered 6,526 casualties, 36% of the division. The Japanese garrison of 10,900 men was almost completely annihilated. Only 202 Japanese prisoners were taken alive. Many of those were men that American medics saved first. Robert Hayes treated 47 wounded Marines during the Peleliu campaign. 17 of them died despite his efforts. He treated 23 Japanese soldiers. 8 survived to become prisoners. The other 15 died either during treatment or shortly after. Hayes never stopped trying. After that first time, Sergeant Kowalski said in a 1983 interview, it became almost routine. Hayes would hear a Jap screaming, and he'd just go. We couldn't stop him. After a while, we stopped trying. We just covered him the best we could. The squad started calling these missions Doc's Crazy Runs, but their tone changed from mockery to something else. Respect, maybe, or bewilderment at a kind of courage they didn't understand. The Japanese soldiers Hayes saved reacted in different ways. Some, like that first kid, were terrified, convinced they were about to be tortured or killed. They fought against treatment, tried to kill themselves, begged for death. Others went catatonic. The shock of an enemy showing mercy was so far outside their understanding of how war worked that they simply shut down. A few seemed to understand, eventually, that Hayes genuinely wanted to save them. One soldier, a sergeant with a shattered arm and burns over 40% of his body, grabbed Hayes's hand after treatment and wouldn't let go. He died an hour later, still holding on. The Marines in Hayes's squad had complicated feelings about what he was doing. "We'd just lost 3 guys to a Jap sniper," Private Miller said years later, "and Doc's over there trying to save some other Jap's life. Made you angry, made you respect him, made you wonder if he was too good for this war or if we were too far gone." Some Marines thought Hayes was a fool risking American lives for the enemy. Others saw something else, that Hayes was fighting a different kind of war, one where the enemy was death itself, not the soldier dying in front of him. "He wasn't making a political statement," Lieutenant Farrell said. "He was just doing what he was trained to do. A medic sees a wounded person, he treats them. Simple as that, except nothing was simple on Peleliu." The Japanese reaction was more profound. Of the 202 Japanese prisoners taken on Peleliu, approximately 40 survived because American medics provided immediate trauma care. This created a cognitive dissonance that some never resolved. In statements given to military intelligence after the war, several Japanese soldiers mentioned American medics specifically. One former private, Takeshi Yamamoto, said in a 1946 interview, "We were told the Americans were demons who would torture prisoners. When the medic came for me, I thought my death had come. But he stopped the bleeding. He gave me water. He spoke to me with gentleness. I could not understand it. I could not understand how an enemy could show mercy. It made me question everything I had been told." Another soldier, whose name was not recorded in the documents, said simply, "I saw an American medic die trying to save my friend. He was shot by our own men while treating a Japanese wound. I still do not understand why he tried." That happened on October 12th, the 27th day of the battle. Corpsman James Burke from Boston was treating a wounded Japanese soldier in a shell crater when a Japanese sniper shot him through the chest. Burke kept working for another 90 seconds before he collapsed. The Japanese soldier he was treating survived. Burke did not. He was 22 years old. Robert Hayes was 30 yards away when it happened. He crawled to Burke, but there was nothing to do. The wound was instantly fatal. Hayes sat there in that crater for 5 minutes, next to his dead friend and the living enemy, and Kowalski said later that was the only time he ever saw Doc cry. Then Hayes picked up Burke's medical bag, went back to work. The emotional toll on the medics who treated enemy soldiers was significant, but rarely discussed. These men were not making grand moral statements. They were not conscientious objectors or pacifists. They had friends who'd been killed by the same soldiers they were saving. But they had taken an oath, not to their country or their service, but to a principle older than flags. First, do no harm. Treat the wounded. Period. You couldn't think about it too much, Hayes wrote in a letter home in November 1944. If you stopped to think about whether this particular wounded man deserved to be saved, you'd go crazy, or you'd let someone die who you could have saved. So you just worked. You saw a wound, you treated it. The face attached to the wound was just a face. But sometimes the faces stayed with you. Hayes kept a list of names in his journal. The Japanese soldiers he'd treated, their approximate ages, what happened to them. Most of the names he didn't know and had to leave blank. But he knew their wounds, their injuries, what he'd tried to do, whether it worked. He kept that journal until his death in 1997. The story of American medics treating Japanese wounded spread through the Japanese military toward the end of the war, though it was rarely discussed openly. Some commanders dismissed it as propaganda. Others worried it would undermine fighting spirit. If the enemy showed mercy, it became harder to see them as demons. A few recognized something profound, that the American medics were demonstrating a different kind of warrior ethic, one based not on contempt for the enemy, but on absolute commitment to a principle that transcended nations. After the war, some former Japanese soldiers spoke about this openly for the first time. Yamamoto, the soldier who questioned everything he'd been told, became a doctor. He said in a 1972 interview that Robert Hayes had saved his life twice, once from his wounds and once from his despair. I was ready to die because I believed I had failed, and death was the only honor left. But the American medic showed me that honor could also mean choosing life, choosing to save rather than destroy. The broader lesson took longer to understand. The Geneva Conventions, which Japan had not signed, were revised and expanded after World War II. The protections for medical personnel were strengthened, the obligations to care for wounded enemies clarified. These changes came partly from documenting what American medics had done in the Pacific, not because they were required to by law, but because they believed it was right. Robert Hayes stayed in the Navy after the war, served another 4 years, got out in 1949 and went home to Duluth. He became a pharmacist like his father. He married, had 3 kids, lived quietly. He almost never talked about Peleliu. When his daughter asked him once why he'd risked his life to save enemy soldiers, he said simply, "They were wounded. What else would I do?" Sergeant Kowalski stayed in touch with Hayes until Hayes died. He said at the funeral, "Doc saved my life once, and probably 20 other guys I knew, but the thing I remember most is him saving those Japs. We thought he was crazy. Now I think he was the sanest one there. The war made us all a little bit animal. Doc was the only one who stayed human all the way through." The Japanese soldier Hayes saved first on that Coral Ridge, the one who tried to kill himself rather than accept help from an enemy, survived the war. His name was Hiroshi Tanaka. He lost his leg, returned to Japan, and, like Yamamoto, he became a doctor. In 1985, 41 years after Peleliu, he traveled to Minnesota. He wanted to find Robert Hayes and thank him. They met in Hayes's pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon in June. Tanaka bowed deeply. Hayes stood there awkwardly, didn't know what to say. Finally, Tanaka spoke in carefully practiced English. "You saved my life when I did not want to live. You showed me that mercy is stronger than hate. I have tried to live worthy of that mercy." Hayes shook his hand. "I'm glad you made it," he said. "That's all any of us wanted, for people to make it." There are 120 Navy corpsmen and Army medics buried in the Peleliu Military Cemetery. 14 of them were killed while treating wounded Japanese soldiers. Their graves bear no special marker to indicate this. They were just doing their jobs. That's what medics do. The Ultra Hook asked why an American medic would risk his life to save a dying enemy soldier. The answer is simpler and more profound than any theory about war or morality, because when someone is wounded and dying, they're not the enemy anymore. They're just wounded and dying, And some men take an oath that doesn't allow for exceptions, even when exceptions might be easier or safer or more popular. Robert Hayes was one of those men. So were hundreds of others, in every war, on every side that honored the principle that medical care transcends politics. They didn't think of themselves as heroes or philosophers. They thought of themselves as medics doing what medics do, treating the wounded, whoever they are, whatever it costs. That's the story. That's what happened on Peleliu and 1,000 other battlefields. The kid from Duluth with a target on his back, kneeling in the coral beside a dying enemy saying, "I got you, buddy. I got you," and meaning it.